Daniel, you're welcome to add whatever information you'd like to about yourself, maybe just where you are generally, what you work on, especially if it's not this, which I assume seems like a pretty big project. So I'm assuming this is taking up some time. We try to do these once a month or so. I think this is our last one for the summer. And then we will kick off again in September, I believe. But stay tuned for announcements around what those papers will be and how we're going to run this next year. I should say in that regard, many thanks to Michele Riccardi in particular and his team at Transcrime, who have been instrumental in getting this off the ground and walking, jogging, running this year. And so we hope to build on this success for next year. So we hope that you will all stay engaged on this because I think there's interesting things that are coming out of it already. So one of those certainly is the conversation that I think we're going to have today. And so I will simply turn it over to you, Daniel. I think if you talked about times, we normally do 30-ish, 35 minutes, I think, right, for presentations, and then turn it over to Q&A. We certainly encourage you to join us on screen during the whole thing or during your question if you'd like to do that. But we will also monitor the message board on this once I remember how to do that on Teams, and we'll make sure we get your questions in as well. So Daniel, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. The slides showing up here?
Yes.
They are.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Mark, for the introduction. Also, thanks, Michele, for inviting me and for helping to organize this whole initiative. Also, everyone here today. So I'm Dan Haberly at the University of Sussex, and I'm presenting a forthcoming paper with a group of people, including Valentina Julo, Tom Shipley, Thomas Bukal, Miroslav Polonsky, and Robert Barrington, called The Regulation of Illicit Financial Flows Dataset, a New World Map of 30 Years of Financial Secrecy and Anti-Money Laundering Reforms. All right, so the basic issue we're looking at here, which is part of a larger project funded by the UK FCDO GIACE program, is that over the past few decades, we've had an intensifying series of initiatives from the national to international levels put together by bodies from the OECD to FATF to EU to US, UK national governments, which are aimed at policing IFFs at all levels, from AML, CFT compliance to fiscally targeted anti-tax evasion and avoidance. In particular, there's been a focus on curtailing the abuses of offshore jurisdictions, however you define those. Ultimately, though, we have a pretty limited understanding of the actual impact of this sort of mounting edifice of policies that's been built targeting IFFs and flows. In particular, we have a shortage of quantitative empirical evidence about what all this activity is actually doing in terms of the world of IFFs. And so there's ultimately two basic challenges in trying to quantitatively assess the impact of the regulatory environment. The first challenge is you have to construct the dependent variable. So you have to somehow measure, estimate, or come up with some sort of proxy for IFFs. This is incredibly difficult, gets a huge amount of attention, and it's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to focus on today is the second challenge, which is putting together the independent variable. So in other words, trying to figure out what does the actual changing historical landscape of global IFF regulation look like at the jurisdiction level that we can feed into a model to determine the impacts on whatever dependent variable we construct. And what's important here is there have been some really incredibly enormous and useful IFF regulatory data sets put together, particularly by FATF, also the Financial Secrecy Index from the Tax Justice Network, which is a huge accompanying data set. But none of these are designed to support time series statistical analysis of the impact of long-term IFF regulatory change across multiple domains. Basically, in order to do this, you need a combination of not just very large scale and long-term temporal coverage, but you also need high temporal resolution. So ideally, you want a new data point every single year for each place and indicator without fail. But probably most importantly, what you need is methodological continuity. So in other words, you need to be sure that the way you're defining an indicator as measured now is the same as it was going back 20 years ago. And what you see is none of these data sets that currently exist, at least for large numbers of indicators, satisfy all of these criteria. And particularly what you see is a tendency for them to basically raise the bar each time they come up with a new iteration of scoring IFF compliance, which makes sense from a political standpoint because they're ultimately trying to raise the bar of how you assess compliance to drive progressive reform. Ironically, what it means, though, is we don't have a particularly good picture of what's already been done and when. They also tend to be released sort of sporadically or at irregular intervals, and not to cover also the early sort of baseline institutional framework going back to the 1990s in particular. And so what we've done to try to fill this gap is construct what we call the regulation of illicit financial flows data set. So it's designed to be sort of the largest scale data set put together to date that can be used for sort of long-term statistical analyses of IFF regulation change and impacts. So to provide an overview of coverage, since we wrote the draft of the paper that I think was linked to in the presentation email, we've expanded the coverage a bit. So we now have 23 different policy indicators over a period of 30 years from 1990 to 2020 in 70 different jurisdictions, basically covering pretty much all of the world's major onshore and offshore financial centers with the latest geographic expansion of coverage. And again, our real focus here is making sure we have time series continuity and consistency. So getting wherever possible a data point that's updated with respect to the timing of regulatory change itself at the jurisdiction level in every single one of these 30 years for each indicator in each place, but also making sure we're applying a completely consistent rubric over time. So we know if we're scoring things one way in 1992, that it's the same way we'd score something in 2020. Important acknowledgement here, we've had quite a bit of support from the Tax Justice Network with a couple of people involved in the paper sort of actually directly working there have really been critical to helping us construct this data set. To provide a quick overview of the indicators, there's basically two groups. So we have, first of all, a number of indicators across the domains of AML, CFT compliance and enforcement. So some of these just cover the sort of basic money laundering and terrorist finance legal framework. We also have groups of indicators covering the rules around suspicious transaction reporting and the whole institutional infrastructure of financial intelligence units for collating that information, and also international facilities for sharing it. And we also have indicators on the level of service provider due diligence, or specifically the stringency of the regulations, both in general and for politically exposed persons specifically. Secondly, we have a number of indicators covered related, though, to the broader financial transparency landscape institutionally. So these cover different aspects of banking secrecy, beneficial ownership transparency, so different aspects of this for companies, but also more broadly for things like trusts and the treatment of bearer shares. And finally, a number of different indicators covering tax-related information exchange, both on demand and automatic through these several different key standards. So what this ultimately allows us to do is to create the first sort of relatively comprehensive picture of how the overall global IFF regulatory landscape has changed since 1990. One of the things that helps here is it turns out most of the regulatory indicators, and particularly the ones that are related to AML, CFT, are pretty strongly correlated with each other over time and space. So we're able to use factor analysis to basically extract the sort of statistical essence of IFF regulatory stringency, which we call RIFF composite score. What we're showing here is the map for 1990, where basically blue is good and red is bad. The main thing you notice is as of 1990, there's essentially no blue on the map. So every place is performing absolutely terribly by a present-day rubric. So if this was what the world looked like now, basically everybody would be on a blacklist. The places where you see a little bit of forward movement, though, are the US and some big developed countries which are allied with the US. This is the sort of early push towards particularly drugs-focused anti-money laundering. And as the 1990s, what you go on is it's mainly the big developed countries, again, led by the US and its allies, which begin to implement some of this basic framework of anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist finance, suspicious transaction reporting. Meanwhile, most big developed countries, but also most offshore financial centers, basically do very little, if anything, during this period. So by the time you get to the turn of the millennium, you see significant progress in the OECD countries and a couple of places in Latin America. Meanwhile, very little progress across basically Eurasian developing countries, but also a lot of very conspicuous little red dots, so very weakly regulated offshore small island jurisdictions. What happens over the next 20 years, though, is interesting. Basically, what you see is as increased political pressure is put on underperforming jurisdictions, particularly offshore small islands, but organizations like FATF and the OECD, you begin to see a pretty rapid process of catching up. And by the time you get to the late 2010s, around 2015, 2018, basically instead of a lot of red dots for offshore jurisdictions, what you see are actually blue dots. So actually, paper at least, like how we're scoring, actually outperforming OECD countries when you look at the offshore divide. You also see pretty good global convergence and IFF regulation overall, keeping in mind there's also some variation there. So if you look at the overall offshore OECD composite regulatory gap, which is this dotted red line here, what you see is it basically peaks in the mid-1990s to early 2000s. That's when you have the sort of first wave of reform in the OECD, while the offshore jurisdictions lag behind. But then by the time you get to around post-2015, 2016, it actually becomes inverted. So at least in the domain of AML-CFT compliance as scored on paper, again, you actually see the offshore jurisdictions as a group outperforming the OECD. Again, this is taking a somewhat formal legalistic approach to scoring things. What's interesting, though, is if we compare this to available information on how stringently these regulations are actually implemented at the service provider level, the offshore jurisdictions actually look even better compared to the OECD, not worse. And the main way we can benchmark this is by comparing our composite regulatory score, which is shown here on the x-axis, to the Global Shell Games compliance score from Finley, Nielsen, and Sharman. Again, basically what they did is they pretended to be various sort of shady actors, contacted different service providers, and saw how stringently they were subjected to due diligence procedures. Basically what we find when we compare our two data sets is, interestingly, any place that was put on the OECD's original 2000 uncooperative list systematically outperforms in observed service provider compliance compared to the regulations on paper. And basically, these are disproportionately small offshore centers. Meanwhile, any place that's an OECD member state systematically underperforms at the level of observed service provider compliance. And this all stands up, as shown in the paper, to multivariate regression analysis. So effectively, you see a topsy-turvy relationship between political power and also some of these sort of stereotypes about compliance and how diligently this is actually being implemented. So we see a little bit of a gap in favor of offshore in terms of AML-CFT regulations on paper, but actually a bigger gap when we look at the diligence of implementation at the service provider level. What's important here, though, is that we also see there's an increasingly complicated landscape of multidimensional IFF regulation, where financial transparency has increasingly become decoupled from AML-CFT instead of sort of firmly wedded to that the way it was in the past. And in this area, sort of financial transparency, this is where you still see offshore jurisdictions underperforming. So what we're showing here, basically on the x-axis, we have our AML-CFT-focused RIFF composite regulatory score. Meanwhile, on the y-axis, we have a different score, which for 2020, basically just composed of the various financial transparency variables, all aggregated again together with factor analysis. First thing worth pointing out is offshore jurisdictions are no longer the most conspicuously bad performers. So if you look at the lower left-hand quadrant, which is sort of lax AML, CTF, and high secrecy, the two places that stand out as really conspicuously bad are two little places called the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. They seem to actually be by far and away the worst and also most consequential problems across these two domains. At the same time, though, if you look at the offshore jurisdictions, which are scored here as orange, you do see an interesting pattern of regulatory divergence. Basically, what you see is they tend to do very, very well on AML-CFT, but they also disproportionately cluster below the average in financial transparency. So it's a combination of complying with the AML-CFT regime very, very carefully, but also apparently trying to maintain this classical provision of financial secrecy. If we sort of deconstruct this a bit, so what we're showing here on the x-axis is the overall OECD offshore regulatory gap, where basically anything below zero, offshore is doing better, anything above zero, OECD is doing better. And we plot that against the overall international variation on the y-axis. It turns out actually a lot of areas of sort of financial transparency Offshore jurisdictions actually, if anything, are doing better. So the sort of whether they create a beneficial ownership, the sort of stringency of updating, also whether they've signed on to the OECD CRS, they're actually doing better to the OECD, similar to what you see for client due diligence. But at the same time, you see there's some areas where there's still a very, very pronounced offshore-onshore gap where offshore secrecy persists, particularly related to the demands of banking secrecy and certain aspects of beneficial ownership registration. Interestingly, the indicator where you have the single biggest offshore-onshore regulatory gap is the same in 2020 as it was in 1990. It's actually statutory banking secrecy. This has been effectively all along the single best sort of discriminator of offshore-onshore, the sort of bastion of offshore secrecy. So again, if we look at our composite AML CFT regulatory score, you see basically this convergence and then inversion in favor of offshore jurisdictions. On the other hand, if we plot the offshore OECD gap in banking secrecy, you see practically no change at all over most of the period. So just persistent offshore sort of classic banking secrecy. A little bit of movement at the end, but really not much. So here's what the map of statutory banking secrecy looked like in 1990. Here's what it looked like in 2020. Compared to what we see in all of the other IFF regulatory domains, it's just remarkably little change. It's a kind of almost unreconstructed landscape of what we would expect offshore financial secrecy to look like. Another area where we see actually a widening offshore-onshore gap in transparency is the transparency of beneficial ownership registers. Again, as we showed in the last figure, if you just look at whether a place has beneficial ownership requirements for companies, offshore jurisdictions do a little bit better than the OECD on average. What you see, though, is they tend to basically hoard access in the hands of the government. So they'll tightly restrict access to official users. Other governments have to sort of go through complicated bureaucratic processes to access this. Sometimes it'll be just a physical terminal with a couple of people who can sign onto it. What they're not doing is making this available to the general public, which is what most OECD countries, but not all, are doing. So you see basically a gap in favor of the OECD in terms of the public availability of beneficial ownership registers. Another area where you see a widening offshore-onshore gap is in the scope of registers. What you see is in most OECD countries, not all, the registration requirements for beneficial ownership are extended in some form, albeit unevenly, to trusts. On the other hand, in offshore jurisdictions, they tend to be very sort of narrowly circumscribed to companies. And so what you see is as the overall bar for company beneficial ownership has been raised, offshore trust secrecy is this sort of conspicuous weakness that's really become increasingly prominent, actually, as the regulatory frontier has progressed. And so in terms of the overall significances of this, I would say this gap between trust versus company beneficial ownership registration is sort of the single most overt bastion that we see in the data set of continued offshore financial secrecy. It's the most sort of overt arbitrage opportunity that we can see in the data set. On the other hand, there's more complicated questions around sort of significance of this persistent gap that we see in statutory banking secrecy and the public availability of beneficial ownership registers. It's a little more complicated to deconstruct why that matters. And the issue here is service providers and governments are collecting more and more client data than ever, including in offshore jurisdictions, and sharing it with each other. One particularly important thing here, particularly in relation to banking secrecy, is that even though the old sort of Swiss-style banking secrecy laws have remained on the books, what you've had layered on top of them is this new regime of automatic information exchange, most importantly through the OECD CRS, which overrides banking secrecy in the case of intergovernmental exchange. What you see is actually offshore jurisdictions have been a little more likely, actually, than OECD themselves to sign up to the OECD's initiative, essentially because the United States hasn't signed on to this. So if you have banking secrecy, the question is, why does it matter if it's overridden by these new intergovernmental information exchange mechanisms? And why does the public availability of beneficial ownership registers matter when governments can get access to this? The reason we argue it does matter, though, is because if you look at who's actually taking the initiative in exposing wrongdoing, sort of initially getting IFF investigations going, particularly related to corruption, it's frequently, and you could argue actually more often than not in the case of corruption, it's not coming from governments who actually have access to the information. It's coming from outside of government, from journalists and civil society organizations. who don't have access to this whole sort of deepening edifice of government information collection, international sharing. And so we argue as this really highlights the need to think beyond sort of just feeding more and more information into the hands of the government to problematize what we call non-governmental financial secrecy and transparency. Some really areas of this is really important. So for example, if you look at some places with statutory banking secrecy laws that have signed on to the OECD CRS, which theoretically overrides them for intergovernmental exchange, you'll see some cases where they're actually still using statutory banking secrecy laws to prosecute whistleblowers and journalists. Another sort of key issue here is highlighted by the impact of leaks, particularly from the ICAJ. Basically what you see is every time a leak comes out, there's a flurry of non-governmental journalistic and civil society investigation, drawing on those leak data, which only subsequently spurs all of these government sort of enforcement actions. So ultimately, this is underscoring the importance of expanding the scope of information availability. And ultimately, it's really in this dimension of public financial transparency where you see the biggest offshore-onshore gaps. Again, if you look at sort of overall financial transparency across all the indicators, there's a kind of modest underperformance in offshore jurisdictions in relation to the AML-CFT. On the other hand, if we just take the sort of public financial transparency indicators, so the sort of statutory banking secrecy laws that can potentially restrict whistleblowing and journalism, and the public availability of beneficial ownership registers, the gap between offshore and onshore gets really, really dramatic. And you end up with some places which effectively have perfect scores on our AML-CFT regime, ending up with a score of sort of flat 0 when it comes to the actual public availability of financial information. All right, so to summarize the overall implications of this, we can see that the global IFF regulatory landscape, but also the onshore-offshore divide, at least in relation to the OECD, has become a lot more complex over the past 30 years. It used to be things were simple, 1990s and early 2000s. Basically, standards were poor everywhere by present-day standards. And to the extent that we did see international regulatory variation, it was one-dimensional. Basically, offshore jurisdictions did worse on everything than OECD countries. So it's a one-dimensional landscape of variation in the limited landscape of regulation that did exist. These days, from the late 2010s onward, it's a lot more complicated. On the one hand, you see very broad international progress and convergence. What you also see, though, is that the international regulatory variation that remains, in particular the OECD offshore divide, has become a lot more complicated. It's basically become multidimensional rather than one-dimensional. Where on the one hand, non-OECD offshore jurisdictions, they look like they're doing very, very well on AML-CFT compliance, particularly CDD, to the extent that they may actually be outperforming the OECD countries. On the other hand, though, what's become decoupled from AML-CFT is financial transparency, particularly public financial transparency, where offshore jurisdictions still tend to lag. And ultimately, we argue what this underscores is that there's fundamentally a mismatch, we would argue, that needs to be addressed between the focus of the international IFF regulatory framework as led by FATF and OECD and the requirements of anti-corruption accountability in particular, but also the sort of policing of IFF wrongdoing more generally. Basically, again, the main emphasis of the whole IFF regulatory paradigm pushed by these organizations is making sure that governments have access to client data fed in by service providers and can share this internationally among themselves. The problem, again, is that the primary initiative behind anti-corruption investigations in particular, but also a lot of other IFF regulations, is that the initiative is not actually coming from government, at least initially. It's coming from non-governmental journalists and civil society organizations who are fundamentally excluded from the whole logic of this IFF regulatory framework. What we'd argue is ultimately the whole scope of the IFF regulatory agenda, as coordinated by these bodies, it needs to be fundamentally broadened and reframed. So rather than thinking about IFF regulation as something that's purely state-centric, instead to think about it as an issue of actually government accountability in a broad sense, needing to rest on broad public foundations, which are enabled through financial informational transparency. But really the key thing is public accessibility of data, particularly beneficial ownership, but also vigilance more broadly about what we call non-governmental financial secrecy, including in areas like statutory banking secrecy laws. Again, a lot of these sort of specific divides, sort of underperformance and public transparency, is disproportionately concentrated offshore. At the same time, though, as you emphasized before, offshore jurisdictions don't seem to be the largest problem in this area, where you see the really strikingly bad combination of lax AML CFT compliance combined with persistently low financial transparency, happens to be the two largest and most powerful countries in the world, the US and China. And ultimately, we can look at these sort of OECD offshore averages at a country level, you see offshore underperformance. But if you look at it in terms of the scale of economic and financial activity, once you put these two places in, you fundamentally see a problem that's rooted onshore, which in the case of the US in particular, ultimately undermines the whole legitimacy and effectiveness of the global IFF regulatory project. So there's been a little progress in the US, or you could say even significant progress in the last year, particularly with the new beneficial ownership register, which comes after our scoring. But even there, you see it lagging significantly. So for example, it hasn't made the register publicly available. The US also still hasn't signed on to the OECD CRS. So ultimately, we argue if there's any takeaway message from this, it would be, yes, there's sort of characteristic ways that offshore secrecy persists, but ultimately, the key thing is the most powerful countries with the largest economies ultimately need to lead by example in pushing these initiatives. All right, so that's all I have for slides today. Thank you.
Dan, thank you very much. That was amazing. Well done. It's a lot of the paper was great, and that was a great presentation of it. So, Michele Riccardi from Transcrime is going to take over and serve as discussant. Michele, I forget what time, how many minutes, just so people know you're going to be.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Daniel. I'll try to be as short as possible in order to leave time for Q&A. It is hard to do that because actually this is a very rich paper, and it was good for Daniel to try to summarize in 25 minutes, but I invite you to read the paper, at least the public version, which is on the Bahamas AML conference website, because it is worth more than one reading, I would say. Just to go straight to the point. So I think this paper is absolutely relevant and addresses a relevant question, which is the question, I think, in AML research policy, which is how effective are AML policies? And as Daniel suggested, I think this paper helps to address at least half of the question, right? Which is how to measure the independent variable, as you say, which is how to measure AML policy, how to monitor the change. Then there is the second half of the question, which this paper does not directly address, which is has IFF or has money laundering changed? And so how to measure IFF, how to measure money laundering. But at least starting addressing half of the question is a good starting point. At the moment, the evaluation, the analysis of the AML policies is left to, I think, the most widely used proxy is the FATF mutual evaluation scores, which a lot of us know that has been heavily criticized over the years for many reasons. And the added value of this RIFF measure, with compared to FATF, I think is exactly that. First of all, it's annual monitoring, while FATF is on average every 5 years, which is quite a long time span. Then it is done by a third party group of scholars, so it's kind of super partes assessment and not a peer review. And I think these are the main somehow advantages with respect to FATF, among others. At the same time, I think that one of the points that I raise is to what extent the RIFF data set, so the measure that you created, is overlapping with FATF. You say at a certain point, RIFF does not attempt to build fine-grained assessment of policy rigor or effectiveness into the coding of regulatory indicators themselves, and you measure the formal statutory change. So is this the FATF compliance concept? And then you elaborate these 23 indicators, and my question is, to what extent are these indicators covering FATF 40 recommendation? What are the differences? What is the overlap among them? And also, what is the correlation between your indicators and FATF mutual evaluation scores? I was just curious if you try to correlate them and to see somehow the similarity among these assessments. Few other things on how the regulatory measure is built, and then I move to results. So I actually read a version of the paper which still had 61 countries. Now there are 70, and so you addressed part of my question, because at that time I think that some key countries were missing, such as India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Mexico, Russia. But I think that you now in your current version you cover some of them, and I think these are key, not just because of the size of the population, of the centrality, geopolitical centrality, but because of also some of them have been grey-listed. Think about Nigeria, for example, or Pakistan for a long time, and therefore it's helpful to see how they changed during the years. The other is related to the time coverage, is 30 years, which is a very long time span, which is very, very interesting. But unfortunately, it stops at 2020. And I think for some of the areas that you cover, the years after 2020 were very crucial. For example, when talking about beneficial ownership reforms or improvements, or the publicity of certain type of other information. Finally, is about the classification. So you have OECD countries, non-OECD offshore countries, and other developing countries. I was thinking if this classification, which makes totally sense, but is still valid. So is the behavior of countries such as Austria or New Zealand so different than Panama or another country? So this ex-ante classification somehow, I think, may risk to have a, to provide a biased view of what could be, results. So you clearly state, you have these immediate results, two trends, a general improvement on the one side and the reduction of the divide on the other. But this is just the first apparent result, and then one has to dig further. But just stopping at this immediate result, just to clarify, is this general improvement mirroring a decrease of illicit financial flows or a decrease of money laundering? No, absolutely not, or not necessarily. This is just mirroring increasing compliance, okay? And the fact, as you have shown, that countries which were uncooperative in 2000 and now outperform other countries, one may interpret it as a result that the FATF, I would say, regime worked well. Well, it worked well in increasing the compliance of this country, but we have no proof that it worked well in terms of effectiveness and in terms of reducing IFF and money laundering. And this is, I think, is always good to stress this, because we do not have to, being confused between the output and the outcome, which are completely two different things. One of the interesting results that you highlighted is that, in fact, looking at certain specific indicators, banking transparency, trust, public beneficial ownership registers, the divide is still there and actually has increased. And I think this is very important. And this concept that you're putting as the governmental transparency versus non-governmental financial transparency, I think this is key. It's very interesting, because it may suggest that if the regime has led countries, to be more and more compliant or authorities and what authorities asked, we still have a big gap in terms of what non-governmental actors instead are allowed to. I think this is a key point that is absolutely crucial. As you say, the role of non-governmental actors in this domain is increasingly important. few last comments. One related to possible use of this regulatory data set. I think it could be this comparison between the RIFF and FATF mutual evaluation. On the one side, I may be interested in understanding how similar they are, how they do correlate, if there is some similarity, because eventually both of them measure compliance. On the other side, given the long time series, I think this could be helpful to see how reactive are countries on FATF mutual evaluation. So if the regulatory changes are somehow the result of mutual evaluation or are introduced in advance to anticipate mutual evaluation. And I think with this kind of time series, with this kind of data set, is something that you can absolutely do, and I think it would be very interesting. A final point on some statistical, on the methodological approach. You use a factor analysis. I think that's a good approach to try to, collapse and condense the many dimensions that you have. Maybe you could not just limit to look at eigenvalues. You could look at the overall contribution to the variance and are in order to following some guidelines on by OECD, by the way, on composite indicators to have a more solid results. And especially, I think it could be very beneficial to have a sensitivity analysis to see how result may change as a result of the application of different parameters, such as different type of rotation, different type of weighting, and so on. And in factor analysis and in principal component analysis, often the devil is in the details. So I think that sensitivity analysis would really provide respect. So these are my comments, but I leave to the colleagues for further suggestion, comments, and consideration. Thank you again for this great paper.
Thank you, Michele. Daniel, you want to take just like a couple of quick minutes just to sort of hit whatever
Yeah, sure.
Here, and then we'll take some questions. And you can come back in.
Yeah, I think those are good points. So I mean, on the relationship to the FATF data set, we use the FATF reports as one of the key sort of raw materials for information, but we basically go through and look for their specific signposting of what the content of regulation is across AML CFT regimes, particularly to get sort of citations of specific laws and years that they tend to reference to sort of reconstruct the time dimension. I would say for some of the indicators, particularly related to client due diligence, I mean, there's a sort of a general alignment with FATF and those domains, although we're effectively rescoring it, again, based on largely what's written in the reports as opposed to their scoring, which could be potentially biased. What we see when we plot it against FATF is the composite score, which is basically heavily weighted towards AML CFT by the factor analysis. It's pretty strongly related, not too surprisingly, with FATF's sort of overall compliance scores for the year, but also pretty strongly related to the Global Shell Games compliance score, sort of assessed empirically. On the other hand, if we look at the separate sort of financial secrecy dimension that we get from just taking the financial secrecy indicators, that has practically no relationship with the FATF data. Instead, that tends to be much more strongly correlated with actually the financial secrecy index, the secrecy scores from TJN. I think partly because that's being fed in, again, sort of deconstructing, going back to their source data and some of the scoring definitions there. But I would say, again, empirically, we see this kind of split between the AML CFT regime sort of as prioritized by FATF, but financial secrecy as sort of prioritized more by TJN. In terms of the factor scoring itself, I mean, there's a huge amount of sort of experimentation that's not really discussed in the paper, played with a lot of different sort of rotations and things. I mean, ultimately, the approach here is used, it's just the simplest possible one, effectively just take the first factor of an unrotated factor analysis to construct the composite score. So sort of the least amount of massaging possible. I would say the main constraint on the factor analysis itself, so you can see how the sort of different indicators align to the sort of score. But given our goal of sort of constructing scores, I mean, the overall definition of the factor, in terms of constructing the country's scores, though, our main sort of constraint is like missing data, which basically destroys the factor analysis if you have too much missing data for particular indicators. So to some extent, what we end up doing is we basically have to select factors for that that have relatively low missing data across most of the countries for the time period, so that we can construct as many of the scores as possible. Based on the sort of sensitivity analysis, I would say they're pretty robust in general. There's a pretty solid dimension of the sort of AML CFT stringency. So yeah, it tends to be generally aligned with FATF. It's not perfectly aligned with FATF reports. I think the R squared was, I can't remember exactly. I actually did some relationships. I think it was something in the 30 to 40% range of correlation, or sort of R squared of this versus the FATF compliance. So it's aligned, but it's also fairly different, but enough to see that's there. You also definitely see, regardless of how you slice things, there is this divergence of the sort of financial secrecy component. One of the things I've sort of been debating is actually whether to add in these explicit sort of scatter plots actually we've created showing this versus FATF indicators. Also, we have things like the sort of OECD scoring of the actual effectiveness of things like automatic information exchange. There's sort of quite a bit that we haven't put in the paper that's sort of lurking in Excel sheets. We've sort of left out the safe space. Let's see what else is here. I think in terms of another issue had to do with the sort of distinction between OECD and developing and offshore countries. Again, that's something where we've had, I mean, this is different debates, sort of experiment with how to divide things. I would say the best evidence that it does matter is the scatter plotting of the RIFF scores against the global shell games compliance scores, that we get such a high statistical significance and the relationship between the two of whether a place is an OECD member and whether a place has been sort of blacklisted by the OECD. So they clearly seem to matter as political categories, at least in terms of how, I mean, it seems to have an empirical impact actually on how diligently AML CFT regulations are being translated from what's on the books into what's in practice. So that's part of why we decided to keep this distinction, is Ian, because of the sort of empirical evidence that OECD membership actually does have, or OECD blacklisting does have an impact, even in this kind of topsy-turvy way where basically the places doing the naming and shaming look worse than the places that have been named and shamed. In terms of the actual impact on IFFs, yeah, I'd agree that we see low evidence of effectiveness. I mean, effectively what we presented here is half of a much larger project. So half of the project is constructing this regulatory data set. The other half is compiling and constructing a number of different IFF and sort of illicit financial network structures. So we've done a lot of analyses with Panama Paradise Papers data. We've constructed new data sets of sanctioned data and sort of documented PEP networks, that sort of thing. Also working with analyses of like portfolio investment and bank deposit data. So to sort of bring in that side. I would say, I mean, there's sort of two things stand out from that. I would say the one is the more effectively targeted your dependent variable is at the actual illicit part of activity, the more that your sampling becomes difficult because you end up with sort of highly concentrated network structures where you can get a result statistically, but it becomes frustratingly difficult to have confidence because not because of the rigor of the analysis, but because of the actual architecture of how the system is put together, which tends to be very, very sort of concentrated in particular structures and pathways. In here we use more sort of broad-based aggregate data sets, we do find empirical impacts. The interpretation, though, becomes complicated. So it's with the ICAJ data, interestingly, what we found is shell company formation seems to go up, actually, in a jurisdiction when it tightens sort of the IFF regulatory framework. So it looks like actually things are being rearranged, at least in the short term, more things being constructed, but drops off. When you look at sort of impact on portfolio investment and bank deposits, which we're still in the process of doing, it looks like more of the opposite pattern, particularly when you're looking at money coming in from relatively more sort of high-risk corrupt places. It looks like you see an initial drop when the sort of regulatory regime is tightened, but then a sort of a rebound and possibly a higher level over the long term. I mean, there's sort of different interpretations of that, which we're still trying to decide to work out and think of sort of secondary tests. I mean, it could be showing that you have sort of short-term impact and a rebound. It could be that the dirty money leaves immediately when things are tightened and sort of good money is attracted by the longer-term tightening. But yes, I mean, this is sort of bringing this together with the actual kind of IFF dependent variables is something we've actually been working on a lot. But I would say it's actually very, very challenging part of that. Part of why we're in the process of the plan is to make this publicly available. So hopefully other people can also plug this together with their own sort of dependent variables of how they've tried to quantify IFFs in different ways and see what sort of impacts they find. Yeah, so I hope that covered, I don't know, Michele, I think that covered most of the sort of points you raised. So.
Yeah, no, thanks. I would leave to the floor for more Q&A.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jonas.
Yes, thanks a lot, Daniel, for a very interesting presentation. Indeed, a very rich paper, which presents a new database, which always directly brings up a lot of questions, probably also for you as researchers when constructing this database. And then there's always the question, how much research should still be in the paper, or what should be further research using this kind of data set? What you do now is mostly focused on this categorization of, well, the political dimension, let's say, so the OECD versus offshore, which I think does give an interesting perspective. The thing I was directly thinking of is what I generally think of when policies and regulations are lagging or missing. Is it because of a lack of ability or a lack of political will? So why are these policies not being implemented? Have you looked at whether it's particularly the poorer countries that are lagging behind? So is there
a reason that's the single biggest explanation of the composite score is just per capita GDP.
Yeah, and so and it's positive, I presume. So
yeah, it's positive,
but
OECD
country,
membership is negative. So effectively, the OECD is depressing. So basically, the sort of RIFF, the regulatory situation on paper is very strongly predicted by per capita GDP. And the sort of observed GSD compliance scores are shaped by positive per capita GDP. But OECD membership disproportionately depresses things even more. It's like even going beyond the positive effect of the high GDPs of the OECD countries. So it looks like the two actually interact. But yeah, per capita GDP is really a big effect.
Yeah, that's what I expected. Thank you.
Other questions from our audience? You see that, Daniel? Do you see Mike Levy's question?
Where's the? Wait, what's the full?
Described as lagging? Is it properly described as lagging behind?
Wait, where's the full wording of that? I just saw part of it was cut off.
That was it. Mike,
is it properly described? No, it was just it was just in response to your either Joras or your comment about them lagging behind.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on whether you think it's working or not. I mean, I guess you could say that it's more about the like
resistance.
We're sort of scoring the quantitative amount of regulation more than the qualitative effectiveness. So I guess you could say like they're lagging behind in quantity doesn't necessarily mean they're lagging in quality.
I was just being a smart ass. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, that's good.
That's shocking, Mike. I don't know. This is new territory for me. So this is a very minor point, actually. Well, there are two kind of small points while I'm thinking of it. One is the U.S. There's a district judge in Texas has struck down the U.S.'s corporate beneficial ownership registry.
Really? When did this happen?
For the time being, in March. And so it's still being weighted. We don't know yet what's going to happen with that. But as of right now, it's on. They have paused that whole process.
So it's like the ECJ with the EU system potentially.
Yeah, right. So it's I was looking this up today actually when I was reading the paper. So we don't know what's going to happen. I then looked up the words for an amicus brief to see like how you when you can submit one of those because presumably the other is you use this term non-governmental financial secrecy, and I only raise this because it's like one of your main points, which I completely agree with. Huge weakness. To me, it's practically meaningless, not entirely, but to have a registry that is only available, with subpoenas or to a few people, especially if it's just government. To me, and this is because I've been writing about today, nonprofits and debanking and stuff, but the term non-governmental financial secrecy sounds like the financial secrecy of non-governmental organizations, right? And so, just as a sort of a marketing, when I hear that term, I hear you're arguing that we need more financial transparency from NGOs, not more CBO, CBO transparency that's accessible to NGOs, basically, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll have to think about that a bit.
That's a stylistic choice, but that's sort of to my brain what I heard there. And only.
When the other thing is, yeah, I'm also thinking about the wording because the thing that also is difficult to demonstrate, but I think there's sort of anecdotal evidence is the non-governmental financial secrecy also becomes governmental because basically you're putting up logistical roadblocks to how difficult it is to get the information. So effectively, if you make things just available on the web, then it's much easier for people working in law enforcement or government itself to access it, even though they theoretically have access otherwise. So, I mean, I would suspect that the two are actually more directly aligned because of these logistical and bureaucratic issues going beyond the letter of the law too. But,
I mean, I completely agree with that. I have always assumed that's basically how they got this otherwise amazing law passed in the United States, right? I don't know how that happens. Right. And it's my skepticism of the banking sector, I suppose. Right. But I got to believe that the only way that gets through is them saying, I tell you what, let's just make this so damn complicated that no one's ever going to really get access to it. And so that can already more or less, often get access to it. And so it's fun. That's the compromise. I don't know if that's true or not, but I completely agree that point is like, if you make it difficult for journalists to get it, you're also making it difficult for anybody but a very few select group of people within one particular branch of the government to get it.
I think
that's a feature not a bug.
You're basically you're restricting it to cases when you have a very clear specific lead that some like law enforcement is trying to follow or something, which is probably shutting down, especially when you think in terms of any sort of potential sort of data-based analysis to try to flag potentially suspicious things. You're effectively shutting all of that down from the outset, but also just logistically making everything harder, like bureaucratically.
Let me see. Does anybody else? I have another question unless someone else does. Yours.
Perhaps a small comment. I think your paper or the data you produce is an important research gap that we have, and you are your work is filling that, and we are here with a group of researchers that might be very much eager to use this type of data also in our analysis. So the question is quite simply, how is the paper coming along, and do you have any ideas on when we can start using it or when it becomes public?
We're hoping July. Again, we've originally we thought, like, I mean, it's at the moment we're working on basically the big documentation file explaining the indicators, scoring, and that sort of thing, and sort of double checking a few final things and updating the paper. I mean, it's sort of 99% ready at this point. We've had to delay past July 4th because it's funded by the FCDO, and basically we have to do like after the election. But yeah, so we'll figure out. I don't know what a sort of opportune timing is to put out this working paper, but with the actual data set.
Put it out before the next static plenary, at least.
Yeah.
But
But I think, yeah, I mean, our target is this summer after the U.S. War of Data Independence.
So can you, I mean, I agree, by the way. I think this is long overdue and well done. You know, it's sort of a mind-bogglingly complex project. You talk in the paper about sort of you basically have 0, 0.5, and 1 scores, right? Can you talk a little bit more, Dan, about how you come to those, just the sort of, sort of methodological process, what you feel like your own confidence in the variation of those is, and just a little bit more about that. Because I'm thinking about the FATA plenary, for example. I can imagine, the U.S. saying, well, you basically misjudged, we're a 1 when you put us at 0.5 or something. So what's the sort of defense of the 0, 0.5, and 1 scores?
I mean, so the numbers are basically something that can be digested by the factor analysis or models. Actually, they're really more qualitative categories. And I mean, because we're doing sort of a very long time period, our kind of the basic logic's pretty simple. Basically, 0 is there's nothing there, which if you go back to the 90s, you find the transition from nothing at all to something. So nothing at the level of on paper, but also it could be that they've got something on paper, but there's no evidence it's been implemented at a basic level, or it's just totally flawed. A 1 would be they sort of check whatever we see as all of the key boxes in the indicator. And then in the middle, we basically decided, again, because we're dealing with a sort of historical period, is to simplify things by saying, it's like, okay, these are places where they have something, but it has some kind of fundamental problem that prevents it from getting a 1. And so that's basically the 3-pronged scoring system. I think if we tried to use anything more complicated, we wouldn't be able to do the whole time period. But this basically allows us to pretty consistently decide. There's a few cases where we sort of annotate, like, there's a gap sometimes of a couple of years where we can't decisively determine, I think it was like 3 or 4 cases, exactly when the increment from sort of 0.5 to 1 came in. So we'll use like another sort of thing there. But in general, we can pretty much say it's like, okay, this place meets all of our requirements, this place does nothing, and this place has some kind of serious problem while doing something. So that would be the sort of qualitative description.
Well, we're at our time. So again, Dan, I think I really enjoyed reading the paper, and I think it's a great project, and will be of tremendous use, I think, to this group of scholars and many others. I also think I would hope it will get some attention in the policy world as well. So thanks for taking the time to share it with us. For those of you on still, thank you very much for attending. Again, my thanks to Michele and Transcrime in particular for shepherding us through this first year of these webinars, and look for more information soon about September. Michele, anything you want to add?
No, nothing to add. Stay tuned on the website as usual, which is www.moneylaunderingresearch.com.
Very good. All right, thank you all. Have a good remainder of your day or evening, depending on where you are. See you around.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Bye.
thanks, Dan.
Thank you.